Rachel Bennett was 7 months pregnant when she vanished without a trace, and her husband, Mark, played the role of a devastated spouse. But beneath his desperate pleas for her safe return lay a dark web of secrets, an affair, a hidden financial trail, and a sinister plan that would shock investigators to their core. What really happened to Rachel? And was it already too late to save her and her unborn child? Fairview was the kind of town where life moved slowly. Neighbors greeted each other on morning walks, families gathered for weekend barbecues, and crime was almost unheard of. That's why, when 30-year-old Rachel Bennett went missing, the community was left in shock. She was 8 months pregnant, just weeks away from giving birth to her first child. Her sudden disappearance turned an ordinary morning into a frantic search for answers. The first call to police came from her husband, Mark Bennett. At 9:12 a.m., he reported that Rachel had gone for her usual morning walk, but never returned. He told officers that she had a routine. She would leave early, take a stroll through the neighborhood, and sometimes stop at the nearby park before heading home. But that morning, something was different. She had been gone for hours, and she wasn't answering her phone. Mark claimed that her belongings, her phone, purse, and car keys, were all still at home, making it clear that she hadn't planned to be away for long. Police wasted no time launching a search. Officers knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, and checked security cameras in the area. Volunteers gathered to help, distributing missing person flyers with Rachel's photo and the details of her last known whereabouts. News stations picked up the story, and soon the entire town was on edge, hoping she would be found safe. At first, Mark's story appeared to check out. A neighbor's doorbell camera captured Rachel leaving the house at 7:30 a.m. She was dressed in leggings and a hoodie, her pregnant belly visible beneath the fabric. She walked at a normal pace, showing no signs of distress. But what troubled investigators was what the cameras didn't capture. Rachel never came back. The footage from multiple homes along her route failed to show any sign of her returning. There were no unusual vehicles, no visible struggle, nothing that suggested she had been taken. It was as if she had simply vanished. Detectives turned their attention back to Mark. He insisted that he had woken up around 8:30 a.m. and assumed Rachel was still out walking. At first, he thought she had stopped for coffee or decided to visit a friend, but by 9 a.m., when she still hadn't returned, he started to worry. He checked the house, saw her belongings still there, and began calling her phone. When every call went straight to voicemail, he dialed 911. Something about his timeline raised red flags. Phone records showed that Mark had started calling Rachel much earlier, at 7:45 a.m., just 15 minutes after she had left the house. If he had still been asleep at 8:30, why had he been trying to reach her nearly an hour before that? Investigators also took note of Mark's behavior. In front of cameras, he appeared grief-stricken, pleading for Rachel's safe return. But behind closed doors, officers noticed something unsettling. His emotions seemed forced, his words rehearsed. Friends of Rachel also began speaking up, revealing that she had recently confided in them about problems in her marriage. She had told one friend that Mark had been distant, secretive, and acting strangely in recent weeks. The search for Rachel intensified, but as more details came to light, detectives began to suspect that her disappearance was no random event. What had started as a routine missing persons case was quickly turning into something far more sinister. As the investigation into Rachel Bennett's disappearance continued, detectives began to focus their attention on the person closest to her, her husband, Mark. At first, he had seemed like a worried spouse, desperate for answers, but as police dug deeper into his statements and actions, inconsistencies began to surface. His timeline of events didn't quite add up, and his behavior, while outwardly distraught, carried a sense of detachment that investigators couldn't ignore. One of the first red flags came from his phone records. According to Mark, he had woken up at 8:30 a.m. and only became concerned when Rachel had not returned by 9 a.m. However, data showed that he had called Rachel's phone at 7:45 a.m., just 15 minutes after she had left the house. If he had still been asleep at 8:30, why had he been calling her so soon after she had stepped out the door? When confronted with this, Mark brushed it off. claiming he must have woken up earlier than he initially thought. But investigators knew that memories around something as significant as the morning your pregnant wife goes missing don't simply become muddled. A more alarming discovery came when a forensic team searched the couple's home. While there were no immediate signs of struggle, cadaver dogs trained to detect the scent of human decomposition signaled an alert near the trunk of Mark's car. The vehicle was impounded for further examination, but no visible evidence of a body was found inside. Investigators knew that just because they hadn't found anything didn't mean nothing had been there. The search of the house uncovered something even more unsettling. In the basement, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, officers discovered a small compartment containing Rachel's prenatal vitamins, a burner phone with its messages erased, and an unmarked envelope filled with cash. None of these items made sense in the context of a simple missing persons case. Who had been using the burner phone? Why was a stack of money stashed away in a place Rachel would likely never look? Most disturbing of all, among the items was a crumpled sheet of paper with a handwritten address and a date, just 1 week before Rachel had gone missing. Investigators tracked down the address and found that it led to a small apartment across town, one that Rachel had never mentioned to friends or family. When police arrived at the location, they expected to find an abandoned rental or a secret hideout, but instead, they found something much more shocking. The apartment was occupied, and the woman who answered the door had a look of pure panic when officers identified themselves. The woman's name was Claire Monroe, a 26-year-old bartender. She hesitated at first, but when pressed, she admitted she had been in a relationship with Mark for over a year. She claimed she had no idea Rachel was missing and insisted that Mark had told her he was going through a divorce. Just a week before Rachel's disappearance, he had assured her that everything was almost finalized. This revelation turned the case upside down. Mark had been hiding an affair for over a year, lying to both women about his intentions. The question now wasn't just where Rachel was, it was whether Mark had done something to make sure she would never come back. As investigators continued digging into Mark Bennett's activities, they realized Rachel's disappearance was not just the result of a failing marriage. It was something far more sinister. His financial transactions and secret messages painted the picture of a man preparing for something well in advance. But what exactly had he been planning? And more importantly, where was Rachel? The discovery of Mark's connection to a disgraced former doctor set off alarm bells. The man, Dr. Victor Langley, had lost his medical license years ago due to illegal and unethical practices. He had been caught running an underground clinic that specialized in procedures no legitimate medical professional would touch: black market surgeries, unlicensed abortions, and even cases of organ trafficking. The connection between Mark and someone like Langley was deeply unsettling. Authorities obtained a warrant to search Langley's last known address, a rundown property on the outskirts of town. The house was empty when they arrived, but what they found inside sent chills through the entire investigative team. The basement had been converted into a makeshift operating room, complete with surgical tools, medical supplies, and an old rusted examination table stained with what looked like dried blood. It was clear that Langley had been performing secret procedures, but there was no immediate evidence linking it to Rachel. Then, in a small locked cabinet, investigators found something they weren't prepared for: a folder filled with documents, including printed emails between Langley and Mark Bennett. The messages were coded but unmistakable. Mark had been paying Langley for something specific, something planned well before Rachel had gone missing. One email stood out among the rest, dated just days before Rachel's disappearance. "Everything is ready. This has to be done before the baby arrives. No complications." This discovery shifted the focus of the investigation from a missing persons case to something far worse. If Mark had gone to such lengths to hide his activities, was it possible Rachel had been taken alive? Could Langley have played a role in whatever had happened to her? Detectives worked quickly to track down Langley, eventually locating him in a neighboring state, staying at a cheap motel under a fake name. When officers stormed the room, they found him alone, but his belongings raised even more questions. Among his possessions were stacks of cash, multiple burner phones, and most chilling of all, a medical chart with Rachel Bennett's name on it. The chart contained notes about a planned procedure, though the details were cryptic. The only words that stood out were extraction scheduled, high risk, urgent. Langley refused to talk, demanding a lawyer as soon as he was taken into custody. But authorities didn't need his confession to know they were running out of time. The evidence suggested that Rachel hadn't simply been harmed, she had been taken for a purpose. The words extraction and high risk suggested that the focus wasn't just on Rachel but on her unborn child. Investigators now faced a terrifying reality. Rachel might still be alive, but if they didn't find her soon, she and her baby could be in grave danger. With Dr. Victor Langley in custody, investigators knew they were close to uncovering the truth behind Rachel Bennett's disappearance. But time was running out. If she was still alive, she might not be for much longer. The medical chart found in Langley's motel room suggested that a dangerous procedure had been planned, and the word extraction loomed over the case like a death sentence. The urgency of the situation pushed law enforcement into overdrive. Detectives worked through Langley's known contacts, tracking his financial records, phone calls, and last movements before his arrest. One lead stood out, an abandoned cabin in a remote area just outside of town. The property wasn't listed under Langley's name, but bank records showed recent payments being made to maintain the land. Authorities suspected this could be the location where Rachel had been taken. A specialized search team was dispatched immediately. Officers moved in cautiously, unsure of what they would find. The cabin was deep in the woods, hidden from the main roads, making it the perfect location to keep someone hidden. As law enforcement approached, they noted signs of recent activity: fresh tire tracks in the dirt, footprints leading toward the structure, and a dim light flickering through one of the windows. With weapons drawn, the officers forced their way inside. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something more unsettling, something metallic, like blood. In the center of the room was a single operating table, medical instruments scattered around it. A small generator hummed in the background, powering an overhead surgical lamp. And then they found her. Rachel was lying on the table, barely conscious, her face pale and her breathing weak. Restraints had been fastened around her wrists and ankles, preventing her from moving. Medical tubing ran from her arm to an IV bag containing a clear fluid, likely a sedative. She had been drugged, but she was alive. A frantic search of the cabin revealed no sign of Langley's accomplices, but the evidence left behind made the situation clear. Someone had planned to perform a forced C-section, taking the baby before it was due. Whether the intent was to sell the child or eliminate Rachel in the process, one thing was certain: she had been moments away from a horrific fate. Paramedics were called to the scene, and Rachel was rushed to the hospital. Doctors worked quickly to stabilize her, and miraculously, despite the trauma and stress, both she and the baby were still alive. However, Rachel was too weak to provide immediate answers. Meanwhile, investigators were piecing together the final pieces of the mystery. Phone records confirmed that Mark had been in direct communication with Langley in the days leading up to Rachel's disappearance. It was now evident that he had orchestrated the entire plan. He hadn't simply wanted to get rid of Rachel. He had wanted to take the baby and erase her from the picture entirely. With Rachel safe but still in critical condition, detectives had only one mission left: to find Mark Bennett before he could disappear for good. With Rachel Bennett rescued and in critical condition at the hospital, investigators turned their full attention to Mark Bennett. He had orchestrated his pregnant wife's abduction, arranged for a disgraced doctor to perform a forced C-section, and had been moments away from stealing the baby. Now, with his plan exposed, he was on the run. Detectives immediately checked his known locations: his home, his office, and even Claire Monroe's apartment. But he was nowhere to be found. His car was missing, and his phone had been turned off. Surveillance footage from nearby gas stations showed him heading toward the interstate just hours before Langley's arrest, confirming their worst fear: Mark was fleeing. An all-points bulletin was issued, and law enforcement across state lines was notified, but Mark had planned his escape well. His financial records showed that he had made large cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to Rachel's disappearance, meaning he had likely been preparing for this outcome all along. Then investigators caught a break. A security camera at a rural motel 2 counties away captured an image of Mark checking in under a fake name. He had cut his hair short, changed into different clothes, and was using cash to avoid being traced. But the most chilling discovery was what he had been seen carrying: a small duffel bag, just large enough to hold crucial travel documents, money, and perhaps a weapon. A tactical team was dispatched to the motel. As they approached his room, they found his car parked outside, its engine still warm. It was clear he had just arrived, unaware that authorities were closing in. The officers moved quickly, surrounding the room and ordering him to surrender. For a tense moment, there was silence, then the sound of movement inside. Officers prepared for the worst, worried that Mark might try to take his own life rather than face justice. But before they could breach the door, it creaked open. Mark stood in the doorway, his face hollow and drained of color. Gone was the confident man who had pleaded for his wife's safe return in front of news cameras. He looked disheveled, exhausted, and most of all, defeated. Without a word, he lifted his hands and surrendered. Back at the police station, Mark refused to speak. He asked for a lawyer and remained silent as detectives laid out the evidence against him. The financial records, the burner phones, the emails to Langley, and most damning of all, Rachel's handwritten journal, which detailed her growing fears about his erratic behavior. Despite his silence, the case against him was airtight. He was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, and multiple other felonies. Dr. Victor Langley, facing his own set of charges, eventually turned on Mark, providing details of their gruesome arrangement in exchange for a reduced sentence. Rachel remained in the hospital for weeks, recovering from her trauma. Her baby, born prematurely due to the stress, fought through complications but survived. In the end, she had lost almost everything: her husband, her sense of security, and the life she had once known. But she had one thing left, the most important thing of all: her child, safe in her arms. Mark Bennett never saw his child again,